Today's episode is brought to you by Marvin Planning Consultants. Marvin Planning Consultants works with communities of all sizes as well as county governments throughout Nebraska and the Midwest. Located in David City, we are a full-service planning firm working on comprehensive plans, zoning, housing, blighted and substandard studies, annexations, and other facets of community and county planning. Hello and welcome to the Booked on Planning podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Rouse, transportation planner with the Lincoln-Lancaster County Planning Department, and I'm joined today by my co-host Eric Wycheck, a planning analyst with the Metropolitan Council in the Twin Cities Metro. We're here to get you hooked on planning through the books that have shaped the field. Let's dive in. Our guest today is Frederick Steiner, here to talk to us about Ian McHarg's seminal book, Design with Nature. Frederick Steiner is Dean and Paley Professor and Co-Executive Director of the Ian L. McHarg Center for Urbanism and Ecology at the University of Pennsylvania Stuart Weitzman School of Design. He has written, edited, or co-edited 21 books, including Design with Nature Now and the forthcoming Megaregions and America's Future. So thanks for joining us today, Fritz. Can you start off by giving us some background on the Ian McHarg Center for Urbanism and Ecology and how it started?
Yes, I started when I returned to Penn as Dean in 2016, and for a couple reasons. One is McHarg himself had started a research center in the 1970s called the Center for Ecological Design and Planning, but it didn't sustain itself. And in general, school programs in landscape architecture and architecture are very good at teaching, and they're very good at spinning off private practices, but aren't quite as good at institutionalizing research. So it was established to help advance the research of faculty and students. And when I came back in 2016, I realized that the 50th anniversary of Ian McHarg's Design with Nature was just a couple years away, and that would give us an opportunity if we used McHarg as the name of the new center. It would give us a way to create a really strong launch of the center.
Really good timing on that. I'll go ahead and hand it over to Eric to ask the first question.
Thank you, Stephanie. It seems no accident that Ian McHarg's Design with Nature was published in 1969, the same year as the moon landing. Astronauts appear throughout the book to aid in understanding the concepts within the book. However, given the popularity of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring in 1962, can you touch on the importance of science literacy and the popular understanding of ecology at this time? In other words, how does the social and political context of the time inform the book's pedagogy and reception?
Let's start with space and the astronauts. And it's also interesting that on the original back cover of Design with Nature was the image of the Earth from space, and it's today what we know as the blue marble, but in those days it was still black and white. So there's this one of the first images of the whole Earth, and which really changed fundamentally how we started to see our home place, our planet. And you're absolutely right. He was very influenced by Rachel Carson and other scientists and science writers. In fact, there's a less well-known person named Lauren Isley from Nebraska. Lauren Isley was in his time probably one of the most, with Margaret Mead, one of the most famous anthropologists. And he had become a public intellectual and had encouraged McHarg. He was the provost at the University of Pennsylvania where McHarg taught, and encouraged McHarg to become more of a public intellectual and encouraged McHarg in his interest with science. So McHarg did a couple things. One, he started a class at the University of Pennsylvania, which became one of the most popular classes. It was called Man and Environment. Today, we, of course, would call it People and Environment, but he called it Man and Environment. And what that did, he brought together both the leading scientists, natural and social scientists, and the leading theologians of the time to talk about their science and what it had to do, or their religion, and what it had to do with the future of the planet. So it was a who's who of luminaries in geology, ecology, and religion. And for example, in ecology, it was the Odum brothers, Gene and Howard Odum. In anthropology, it was Margaret Mead. And then with McHarg grew up a Presbyterian, a very sort of strong religious background, but he grew very critical of the Judeo-Christian ethic, and often would cite a passage where it states that our role as humans is to multiply and subdue the earth. So McHarg was looked at other religions and other faiths. So there's this interface between science and also social concerns, and that were very deep. So that was one thing he did, the course. And the other thing he did, he had a TV program for 2 years called The House We Live In. And he would bring together also, again, for 2 years, the same group of leading scientists and theologians. I mean, it's kind of interesting to think about today. And it was a Sunday morning program, a talk program, and here's this fellow with a really thick Scottish brogue chatting with Lewis Mumford about the future of the planet, or the Odums, or leading physicists and theologians. So the course and the TV program literally acquainted him with some of the leading scientific ideas of the day, and that very much informed the writing of Design with Nature.
I'm curious, is that course still taught today in some version, or has that gone by the wayside?
It's I think, been more institutionalized. It's spawned other like courses at other universities. And in fact, I was involved in various versions of a similar course at Washington State University, and later at the University of Colorado as well. So the thinking, the multidisciplinary thinking, I think has influenced continued ideas about sustainability and regenerative design and resilience, certainly. But there's no course on the books called Man and Environment today.
So the book essentially takes us through various case studies which showcase what McHarg terms physiographic determinism, or that development should respond to natural processes. The suitability of development is determined through a layering of physical processes, which we could call an early form of Geographic Information Services, or GIS. Can you speak a little bit about how Design with Nature had an impact on planning analysis and landscape architecture analysis in GIS?
Yes, certainly. First of all, you're right that Design with Nature is a series of case studies that were either undertaken as studio projects at the University of Pennsylvania or at McHarg's firm, Wallace, McHarg, Roberts, and Todd. So he was very much a reflective practitioner. He would go out and try these ideas in real projects or in studio projects, and then reflect on them, and that's what's reported. McHarg was very involved in the development of what we call GIS today. In the 1960s, late 1960s, he was using computer mapping, and most of the leading GIS manufacturers credit McHarg with his idea about layering information as fundamental to GIS. McHarg basically used map overlays to determine suitabilities for various uses. Now, map overlays, the first use in planning and design came in the Olmsted office in the late 19th century, and the first documented use is in the 1890s. And basically, maps were just overlaid physically in the Olmsted office, where they were on the windows of the studio. Early in my life, it was on light tables where you would overlay the maps. And McHarg's contribution was not inventing map overlays. That he was very familiar with that. It was using ecology, the science of ecology, to inform the order of map collection and how the maps would be overlaid, and was always looking for ways to do that more accurately and more effectively, and saw fairly early on that computer mapping technology was a way to do that. So he very much involved with what we now call GIS, but also in environmental resource assessment. You can also track that directly back to the same approach.
To build off that answer, the book also discusses natural processes that perform work for humanity. So today we would probably call these ecosystem services, trying to quantify the benefits, for instance, of like tree canopy. McHarg states that one of the challenges is that while these processes have immense value to support life on Earth, we do not attribute value to these processes in our planning functions. Do you feel that this thinking has evolved much since Design with Nature was written? And if so, how?
I think that exactly has helped. One can criticize the ecosystem services concept as being rather anthropocentric, but I think it is effective in saying, well, this soil, if you don't have soil, you're not going to eat, and then water is, you're not going to have something to drink. So ecosystem services has attempted to give value to the work that nature does for us, and that we, as McHarg and others have observed, that we too often take for granted. So I think it's been that's been a key advance. Also, the science of landscape ecology and the science of urban ecology have also helped us understand both the ecology of landscapes and the ecology of cities in a deeper way than existed in McHarg's time.
In the plan for the valleys example in Maryland within the book, the case study actually performs a cost-benefit analysis of a business as usual or unplanned growth scenario, and found that the economic benefit of the plan or physiographic determined development model was more profitable in the long term than unplanned growth. Planners still struggle with this challenge of elected officials' preference for market-driven development as opposed to planned development. What lessons can we take from McHarg's approach and analysis to this often political challenge?
Well, I think it's making the cost and benefits explicit, as McHarg did with the plan for the valleys. One of the interesting things about the plan for the valleys is it still exists. There's a group of people that to this day still follow McHarg's suggestions in that part of Maryland and have been pretty successful at guiding development. So I think for other jurisdictions, I think it's cost-benefit analysis is part of what we need to do. The other is to ask the question, who suffers and who benefits? Because there's an equity dimension as well. So there's a number of examples of scenario planning where it's clear that the business as usual model is more costly. The work that Peter Calthorpe and John Frederick Fregonese did in Envision Utah. They did Envision Central Texas, which I was involved with them, and several others, takes that approach from the Plan of the Valleys and advances it very much for the 21st century. And the Envision Utah was very successful politically, and Utah is not Portland, Oregon. It's a bit of a conservative place, and I think the logic of growing responsibly won out. To go further, it's then looking at various scenarios and ask the very vital question of who's going to benefit from this scenario and who's going to lose from it. And I think we need to do that to ensure that there's not the consequences of poorer folks paying the bill for change.
Another interesting consideration within the book is the idea that land, air, and water resources are indispensable to life and thus constitute social values. This idea, I would argue, reflects more of an indigenous approach to land use planning akin to reciprocity. Yet we still seem to consider social benefits as separate and discrete from the environment. Even the sustainability movement from the 1990s onward had social considerations and environment as separate legs of a three-legged stool. Do you think that land, air, and water resources have not been fully embraced as social values? And if so, why do you think this is?
Well, again, McHarg would argue, and I tend to agree with him, part of our cultural orientation has devalued them, and I think both, as McHarg pointed out, the Judeo-Christian tradition, and I would also argue that capitalism tends to undervalue natural resources. I think that was part of, in this quest that McHarg had for looking at other religions, he was very drawn to indigenous, as you point out, to indigenous religions, and saw that indigenous people had a different relationship. He almost got overly romantic about it. He did a PBS documentary called "Multiply and Subdue the Earth," and he's wandering around somewhere in Arizona talking with a Hopi elder, and it's a very kind of funny interchange because McHarg is explaining to this man what his religious values are, but with great gusto and great enthusiasm. So I think that part of and the irony is that if we look at look deeper into the Judeo-Christian ethic, you get to ideas about stewardship, about conservation and allowing the land to rest after so many days. So I would argue that there are parts of the Judeo-Christian tradition that value the land. And I also, if you look at the tradition of democracy, it doesn't necessarily always favor capitalism. Thomas Jefferson, for all of his quirky strengths and weaknesses, wrote that we had the right to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not the pursuit of property, as it had originally been written, but the pursuit of happiness. You got to give a bit of a shout out to Jefferson for making that change. So even though Jefferson wrote about the pursuit of happiness, it seems like Americans have been pursuing property ever since.
I almost think that we're starting to realize the value of these resources more recently. We've seen so many communities daylighting rivers that they had concreted or built over, or adding things like bioswales and rain gardens to our right-of-way infrastructure and trying to bring little bits of it back, but it's almost a little too late in some instances because you've already kind of leveled everything and flattened what was there.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to do. But I think one could argue or one could observe that with especially people of your generation rightfully being alarmed about climate change, it becomes clear every day with the extreme weather events that are happening around the world that this is real. And so and I think McHarg provides the idea that we design with nature, not against nature or by nature, but with. That with is, I think, really important. Helps us to think about both adaptation and mitigation of climate change in a more responsible way and probably a more holistic way, which is needed. I mean, I was a Boy Scout, and some of this stuff is just common sense. I mean, as a Boy Scout, you're taught you always leave the campsite better than what you found it. I mean, man, why can't we just all be better Boy and Girl Scouts and leave the planet a better place than what we found it?
So kind of building off what you had said earlier about McHarg's concern about people having what they need, the book also is interesting because it specifically calls out the equitable distribution of benefits. This is something we as planners still struggle to achieve in our practice, especially when we think about access to political power, environmental justice, and civil rights. How do you feel design with nature has influenced equity and environmental justice considerations in the planning and landscape architecture fields?
A recent book by Kate John Elder, who teaches at Rutgers, who looks probably more deeply than anyone else about McHarg's social agenda and equity agenda. And she gives him high marks for in some areas and is critical in others. But McHarg was, in his autobiography, he talks about his interest in civil rights and equity. One attempt is there's a part of Design with Nature where he does maps of disease and health, and shows that poor communities have higher risks of health, and health was a huge concern of McHarg's. And I think his positive contribution is acknowledging that there's a relationship to where we live and public health, and he very much was interested in that. Unfortunately, I think some readers of Design with Nature kind of misread that and see it as an anti-urban bias, which he was a very urbane man, and he grew up in Glasgow and lived in Philadelphia, so he was not anti-urban, but because these maps show how unhealthy it is to live in poor neighborhoods, and I think that we need to do more of that and to show. Recently there's been a fair amount of work looking at the residual consequences of redlining, and one of the residual, lots of underinvestment, lack of trees, and so with less trees and more asphalt, as urban heat islands get hotter, it puts people who live mainly poor and minority people at greater risk. And I think McHarg, those sort of urban maps that he did looking at disease and health are worth another look. And Kate John Elder does a nice job in her book probing those studies and others that where McHarg took on social issues. Also, his educational background, he's both educated as a landscape architect and a city planner. And he gravitated towards city planning because of the social concerns that the planners were addressing. He was critical of planning community for not going far enough to understand environmental aspects, and also moving a little bit, and I think I would agree with him, a little bit further away from design, and not understanding that design could be used as a tool to implement planning policy.
I think that's one of the things I appreciated about the book was like his consideration of a qualitative sort of practice as opposed to what we tend to do here in the US, which is more quantitative. It kind of touches on setbacks and requirements like that. But, looking at things in a more holistic way, which we don't tend to do. And I know that there's like history around litigation, with making sure that people meet the code kind of thing. So, I actually started my planning practice in Scotland where there was a much more qualitative approach. And I really appreciate that because you'd actually look at different developments on a more case-by-case basis as opposed to this sort of, tick box exercise. And I feel like McHarg's trying to encourage us to look beyond that. In my view, one of the most interesting parts of the book is his ecological consideration that all organisms must concede some part of their autonomy so that the system can be sustained. You kind of touched on this when you talked about his Judeo-Christian background and kind of moving away from the dominion to a more kind of equal footing with all creation. He talks about this concept as a uniqueness of all beings in contrast to that concept of superiority or inferiority. In focusing on the uniqueness inherent in all natural phenomena, he focuses on reciprocity. This reminds me of recent research that has found that trees, even of different species, communicate with one another via underground fungi, for instance. McHarg's ecological understanding was refined enough to understand these connections even before the science could show this. Can you speak to how this evolving understanding is shaping the field and adding credence to McHarg's arguments?
The ecological understanding of his time I mentioned the Odum brothers, and one of the Odum brothers was sort of advanced the idea of ecosystem studies. So the idea of ecosystems goes very much back to Eugene Odum. And Howard Odum was more focused on energy. In fact, he influenced a lot of the thinking in ecosystem services. Howard Odum did. Robert Costanza, one of the major figures in ecosystem services, was one of Howard Odum's students. By the way, the Odum's father was a sociologist who helped found the planning program at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So the Odums, saw the social benefits of ecology, and they influenced McHarg in that regard. There was also here at Penn, there was it was sort of the center of what was called community ecology, and one of the key people in that area is a man named Robert MacArthur. And Robert MacArthur worked with E.O. Wilson on biogeography and the island concept. And he was one of Richard Foreman, who sort of advanced landscape ecologies professors. So I think where this all comes together is in the ideas about hierarchy and scale. And McHarg very much understood what was whole at one level was a part of at a higher level. So if you have a cell and a cell is whole, but when a cell is part of a body, the body is whole, and the cells are just part of us. But then we're whole, but we're part of something bigger. So I think the thinking of in biological terms, in terms of hierarchy and parts and wholes, very much is in line with. He would love the idea that trees talk to each other. I mean, that would just make him so happy, that notion. So it is very much in line with his thinking. He also was influenced by a biologist named Lawrence Henderson. And Henderson wrote a lot about the fitness of an organism. And Henderson was a follower of Darwin. And there's another Scotsman, I'm sure you guys are aware of, Patrick Geddes. And Patrick Geddes also was influenced by Darwinism. And what fascinates me about Geddes is his ideas about evolution, and that species participate in their own evolution. And for humans, according to Geddes, it was planning and design were the instruments of how we participate in our own evolution. So the sort of Darwinist ideas about evolution and our participation in evolution and fitness, and some habitats being more fit than others, is very consistent with contemporary ideas about, or contemporary research and findings in biology.
So going back to one of the main through lines in the book, this metaphor that he uses regarding the astronaut. The book talks about how the astronaut only learns about interdependency of all living things once he realizes that he needs all those living things to survive, in his capsule orbiting the Earth or the Moon. The book mentions the need to go beyond the shade of the forest to understanding the interactions therein. A world of understanding opens when this happens. Can you speak about the importance of understanding natural processes in ecology, in planning, and landscape architecture fields?
Well, there's several ways. The one way is it can help us avoid making mistakes. So if we understand the nature of a place, and we understand, this area over here is a floodplain, and if you put a house in the floodplain, when it floods, people can die and their property be damaged. So you can, by understanding and how to read and interpret landscapes, we can help people avoid making costly and life-threatening mistakes. So in the United States, the reason for the profession of landscape architecture and the profession of planning is to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. And if you aren't protecting the public health, safety, and welfare, you shouldn't be licensed as a landscape architect. If you aren't protecting the health, safety, and welfare of people, your license as a landscape architect should be revoked, and your certification as a planner should be. So at a very basic level, understanding places and where places put people in danger is just, I think, fundamental. Beyond that, it's looking at how do you find places that are more healthy and better for places. I mean, Vitruvius, the Roman architect, wrote 10 books of architecture. Vitruvius, the Roman architect, wrote 10 books of architecture. And early on, he talks about doing an ecological analysis. So what Vitruvius did was you go out and you find a rabbit and kill it and look at its liver. And is it a healthy liver or and so basically I'm not advocating going out and killing bunnies and looking at their livers, but there's a very old tradition of looking for the most healthy places for people to live. So I think avoiding death and destruction is reasonably responsible thing for landscape architects and planners to do. But beyond that, I think it's are there interventions that you can do that improve people's lives? Going back to the urban heat island, just reducing the amount of asphalt and planting trees can make those places more livable and reduce health risk for the people that live there and make their lives better. So it's not only avoiding bad stuff, it's also making the world a better place for people to live too. And the more we understand about the nature of a place, the better we can do our jobs to ensure that.
I would just say I think the communities and the departments that do the best or that address this the best are the ones that have a lot of communication among the different departments, that bring in their health department to talk about these things, that have parks involved to do things like plant trees and more having parks within a walking radius of all communities, and that make sure that they set up their communication systems to keep everyone involved.
I would probably second that and also say that it's incumbent upon us as planners to learn more about the natural environment, even outside of our profession. One thing I've noticed going back to that question is, I used to see the forest as a forest, but once you start learning the different plants in the forest and seeing them as part of a whole, you start to see the forest in a whole different way. And, that will affect how you think about land use and protecting and preserving these spaces. You touched earlier on climate change. So I think that leads to a natural question about how this really seminal, important book fits into our present context, right? I was reading the book and I kept thinking about this final line from the scientist played by Leonardo DiCaprio in the recent doomsday film, Don't Look Up. I don't know if you've seen that. But a bunch of friends are sitting around a table and having a final meal as a comet heads crashing towards the Earth. And the scientist says, "We really did have everything, didn't we?" Which I thought was so powerful, just that line. It reminded me of McHarg. How does design with nature fit into our present moment with climate change?
Like in that movie, we have all the information we need. In comparison to McHarg's time, every place, certainly in the United States, but much of the world, I was doing a project in Montenegro a couple of years ago and could find the geology, the soils, the hydrology, the plants, the animals, everything remotely from Austin, Texas. So we have all of the information about the planet we need to respond to climate change and make the world a better place, but we lack wisdom. We lack the wisdom to use, the movie is a very powerful example. And I think one of the areas that is a pity since McHarg's time is, as we started our discussion, after the Russians launched Sputnik, there was a desire to advance science in the United States. And even we have tools to protect us from pandemics, and people don't take advantage of that. They don't take advantage of the science. So someone observed a few years ago that our species has been misnamed Homo sapiens. We're not wise. We're not a wise species. I mean, we should have our title revoked, and or we should live up to our name. We should become a wise species. And a wise species would embrace science, try to understand science, and then apply it to how we design and plan our environment. So I'm the co-chair of the design review committee here on campus, and that means we review all the architecture and landscape architecture on campus. Yesterday we were meeting with a well-known architect, Stephen Hall, who has a new building, and it's a kind of tall building. And one of our design review committee members, Karen McCluskey, who's a landscape architect, asked about birds and ensuring how the building could be designed so birds don't crash into it and die. And Stephen Hall just was so receptive to that, and said, "I'll do anything I can. We need to design so birds don't die, and how do you reduce glass surfaces, and how do you make it more legible?" And it became fairly clear right away that we have the knowledge to design, in this case, a building to be more bird friendly. It's just having the wisdom to do so. And I felt very gratified that during the review process, one of the reviewers pointed this out. And instead of acting negatively or dismissively, the architect embraced it and said, "Let's do what we can." And to me, that's wisdom. It's knowing everything you can, in this case, about a bird and how to keep the birds alive, and then designing the building accordingly.
And that's really refreshing to hear. I remember that conversation came up quite often when I was as a city planner working in Minneapolis, especially with the new stadium going up and its mass sitting downtown and how to keep the birds alive. So something interesting to keep in mind. As we wrap up here, the final question that we have for you today is, what is the most important thing that our listeners and readers should take away from Ian McHarg's book, Design with Nature, and our conversation today?
That understanding ecology, understanding how organisms, including us, relate to other organisms and are built in natural environments, that understanding, gaining that understanding and applying it to real places in a thoughtful way, in a wise way, can help us build communities that are healthy and that are prosperous for future generations.
All right. Well, so I just want to thank you again for taking the time to talk with us today and coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was excellent, Fritz. I learned a lot. Thank you.